The history of slavery is a painful and distressing aspect of humanity's past, and within that narrative lies a particularly harrowing chapter known as African slave breeding. This video aims to shed light on the disturbing truth behind this practice, which involved the systematic breeding of enslaved Africans during the transatlantic slave trade. By exploring the motivations, methods, and consequences of African slave breeding, we can gain a deeper understanding of the atrocities endured by countless individuals and the long-lasting impact on African diaspora communities. Motivations for African slave breeding. African slave breeding emerged from the insatiable demand for slave labor in the Americas and the pursuit of economic gain by slaveholders. As the transatlantic slave trade flourished, plantation owners sought to maximize profits by increasing the number of enslaved individuals they owned. Slave breeding offered a means to maintain a constant supply of laborers without incurring the high costs associated with importing slaves from Africa. Methods employed in African slave breeding. Slave breeding involved the deliberate pairing and forced mating of enslaved African men and women, often against their will. Slaveholders treated enslaved individuals as commodities, viewing them solely as breeding stock to produce offspring who would grow into profitable laborers. These individuals had no control over their reproductive choices, relationships, or the fate of their children. Families were routinely separated, with children often being sold to different owners. The impact on enslaved individuals. African slave breeding caused immense suffering and trauma for those subjected to its dehumanizing practices. Enslaved individuals were stripped of their autonomy and treated as mere instruments of production, denying them their basic human rights. The violation of their bodies, emotions, and familial bonds perpetuated a cycle of intergenerational trauma that still resonates within African diaspora communities today. The consequences for African diaspora communities. The practice of African slave breeding left an indelible mark on African diaspora communities, shaping their experiences, identities, and social structures. The forced separation of families disrupted cultural continuity, eroded social cohesion, and weakened community ties. The trauma inflicted on enslaved individuals and their descendants continues to reverberate through generations, impacting mental health, self-perception, and the preservation of cultural heritage. Acknowledgement, healing, and reconciliation. Recognizing and acknowledging the disturbing reality of African slave breeding is crucial for promoting healing and reconciliation. By confronting this painful history, societies can foster empathy, understanding, and dialogue. Initiatives such as Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, memorialization projects, and educational programs can help bring awareness to this dark chapter and work towards rectifying its enduring effects. Economic exploitation and profits. African slave breeding was driven by the insidious motive of economic exploitation. Plantation owners saw enslaved individuals not only as a source of labor, but also as valuable assets whose offspring could be sold for profit. The systematic breeding of slaves ensured a self-sustaining workforce, minimizing the need for expensive imports from Africa. This dehumanizing practice prioritized economic gain over the dignity and well-being of enslaved individuals. Dehumanization and objectification. African slave breeding epitomized the dehumanization and objectification of enslaved Africans. By treating them as breeding stock, slaveholders reduced human beings to mere commodities, devoid of agency and personal autonomy. Enslaved men and women were reduced to their reproductive capacities, stripped of their humanity and denied the fundamental rights to choose their partners, form meaningful relationships, and raise their children. Psychological and emotional toll. The practice of African slave breeding inflicted severe psychological and emotional trauma on enslaved individuals. Forced procreation, separation from loved ones, and the constant threat of having their children sold away created an environment of fear, powerlessness, and despair. The psychological scars of this practice continue to reverberate through generations, impacting African diaspora communities' collective consciousness and mental well-being. Racialized control and power dynamics. African slave breeding perpetuated racialized power dynamics, reinforcing notions of white supremacy and black inferiority. Slaveholders sought to manipulate and control the reproductive capacities of enslaved individuals, treating them as mere means to maintain and expand their economic dominion. This oppressive system further entrenched the racist ideologies that underpinned slavery, reinforcing the devaluation of black lives and perpetuating systems of racial oppression. Long-term social and cultural impact. The practice of African slave breeding had far-reaching social and cultural consequences. The forced separation of families and disruption of kinship networks not only fractured individual lives, but also eroded the social fabric of African diaspora communities. Cultural traditions, customs, and identities were often suppressed or lost, leaving lasting gaps in the historical and cultural heritage of these communities. Resistance and resilience. Despite the dehumanizing effects of African slave breeding, enslaved individuals exhibited remarkable resilience and resistance. They found ways to resist and subvert the system, preserving their humanity and maintaining their sense of self. From clandestine relationships to secret communication networks, enslaved individuals demonstrated resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. Path to healing and reconciliation. Acknowledging and confronting the disturbing truth about African slave breeding is an essential step towards healing and reconciliation. It requires an honest examination of history, meaningful dialogue, reparations, and the dismantling of systems that perpetuate racial inequality. Healing the wounds inflicted by this practice involves fostering understanding, promoting equality, and creating a just society that acknowledges the humanity and dignity of all individuals. In conclusion, the practice of African slave breeding during the transatlantic slave trade reflects the depths of inhumanity and oppression experienced by enslaved Africans. Understanding its motivations, consequences, and long-term impact is crucial for recognizing the enduring trauma endured by African diaspora communities. By confronting this disturbing truth, societies can work towards justice, healing, and the eradication of systemic racial inequality.